Lake Tahoe, Nevada, August 1991. A stunning alpine lake straddling the California-Nevada border where crystal-clear water reflected surrounding mountains, where families camped along sandy beaches, and where summer brought tourists seeking escape from the heat of cities like Reno and Sacramento to enjoy the cool mountain air and pristine wilderness. The Kenrick family from Carson City had reserved campsites at Sand Harbor State Park for their annual summer reunion, and 15 family members, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, gathered for 4 days of swimming, hiking, and bonfire dinners, a tradition they had maintained for over a decade. Marlowe Kenrick was 6 years old with hair so blonde it was almost white, pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, and a quiet demeanor that made adults describe him as shy or withdrawn, though his mother Janet insisted he was simply observant and thoughtful. He was the older of 2 sons. His younger brother Dylan was 4, and while Dylan was energetic and loud, Marlowe preferred to sit alone collecting bird feathers and rocks, organizing them by color and size, and he carried everywhere a small red backpack with an astronaut patch that his father Stephen had given him for his 5th birthday. The Kenrick family had driven from Carson City on Friday, August 9th, arriving at the campground around noon, and they set up 3 large tents in adjacent sites, with Stephen and Janet's tent housing their 2 boys, and the grandparents and various aunts and uncles in the other tents. Friday afternoon was spent swimming in the lake, and Marlowe stayed close to shore collecting smooth stones while Dylan splashed with cousins, and Janet kept an eye on both boys while chatting with her sister-in-law, and everything felt safe and normal and exactly as these trips always felt. Saturday morning began with breakfast cooked over camp stoves, pancakes, and bacon that everyone ate at picnic tables, and Stephen's father Paul announced they would hike the Marlowe Creek Trail that afternoon, a moderate 2-mile loop that was appropriate for children and offered beautiful views of the lake. Around 2 o'clock, 12 family members began the hike, including Marlowe, who carried his red backpack containing his rock collection, a water bottle, and the bird identification book Janet had bought him, and he walked between his parents while Dylan rode on Stephen's shoulders, chattering about everything they saw. The trail was busy with other hikers enjoying the beautiful August weather, and the Kenrick group spread out along the path with faster walkers pulling ahead and slower ones lagging behind. And about 40 minutes into the hike, they stopped at a scenic overlook to rest and take photographs. Janet counted heads and realized Marlowe was not with the group, and she asked Stephen where he was, and Stephen said Marlowe had been right behind them just a minute ago, probably stopped to look at something on the trail, and he walked back calling Marlowe's name. After walking back about 50 yards without seeing Marlowe, Stephen's voice grew louder and more urgent, and other family members joined the search, walking up and down the trail calling for Marlowe, asking other hikers if they had seen a small blonde boy with a red backpack. No one had seen him. The trail had been crowded, and it was easy for a child to blend into the groups of hikers moving in both directions, and Janet began to panic, saying Marlowe would not wander off. He always stayed close. Something was wrong. Paul called 911 at 2:50, reporting that his 6-year-old grandson was missing from the Marlowe Creek Trail, and within 20 minutes Nevada State Park Rangers and Douglas County Sheriff's deputies arrived, and they began organizing a systematic search of the trail and surrounding area. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel, and if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA Archives, where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. Search and rescue teams arrived with dogs, and they were given Marlowe's sleeping bag from the tent to establish his scent, and the dogs tracked along the trail, but then the scent diverged off-trail into dense forest heading downhill toward the lake, and the terrain became steep and rocky, making tracking difficult. Detective Karen Foster from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department took lead on the case, and she was 38 years old with 15 years of experience, and she interviewed each family member, asking when Marlowe was last seen, what he was wearing, if he had seemed upset or mentioned wanting to leave. Everyone said Marlowe had been wearing blue shorts, a white t-shirt with a dinosaur on it, and his red backpack, and he had seemed normal and quiet as always, and no one had heard him say anything about leaving the trail or going anywhere alone. The search expanded through the afternoon and into the evening with helicopters using thermal imaging, with volunteers from nearby communities arriving to help, and with Janet and Stephen staying at the trailhead refusing to leave, and Marlowe's name echoed through the forest as hundreds of people searched. By nightfall, there was no sign of Marlowe. No backpack, no piece of clothing, nothing to indicate where he had gone after leaving the trail. And the search continued through the night with flashlights and spotlights illuminating the dense pine forest. The search continued through Sunday with over 300 volunteers combing the area around Marlowe Creek Trail, checking every ravine and clearing, looking behind boulders and under fallen trees, but no trace of Marlowe was found despite the massive effort. Detective Foster interviewed campground staff and other campers asking if anyone had seen suspicious vehicles or people, if anyone had noticed a man or woman alone paying unusual attention to children, but no one reported anything concerning. She also investigated the possibility of family involvement, interviewing Stephen and Janet separately and asking about their marriage, their finances, if there were any custody disputes or family conflicts, but both parents were cooperative and devastated, and there was no evidence suggesting family involvement. The grandparents, Paul and Margaret Kenrick, were also interviewed, and both said Marlowe had been a quiet child but seemed happy, that they had no concerns about abuse or neglect, and the family appeared close-knit and loving. Media coverage began immediately with Marlowe's school photo showing his pale blonde hair, and serious expression appearing on news broadcasts throughout Nevada and California, and the story of a child vanishing on a family hike captivated the region. Janet appeared on television pleading for Marlowe's safe return, describing his red backpack with the astronaut patch, his habit of collecting feathers and rocks, his quietness, and begging anyone who had seen him to come forward. Days turned into weeks with searches expanding to cover miles of wilderness around Lake Tahoe, with dive teams searching the lake itself in case Marlowe had somehow made it to the water and drowned, but his body was never found. The case went cold by October 1991 with no suspects, no evidence beyond the scent trail that had led into the forest, and no credible sightings despite posters distributed throughout Nevada, California, and neighboring states. Janet and Stephen returned to Carson City, but their lives were shattered, and Janet could not return to her job as a librarian because she could not focus, and Stephen struggled to work as an accountant while wondering if his son was alive somewhere. Dylan grew up without his older brother, and he had only vague memories of Marlowe, remembered him as quiet and always carrying his red backpack, and the family marked Marlowe's birthday every year with a small ceremony, never giving up hope he might come home. Years passed, and Marlowe's case became one of Nevada's most haunting unsolved missing children cases, and his age progression photos showed what he might look like at 10, at 15, at 20, at 30, but no one matching those images ever came forward. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them, so if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. Detective Foster retired in 2008 after 32 years in law enforcement, and Marlowe's case remained unsolved, the little boy who vanished from a family hike, and the file was passed to younger detectives who reviewed it periodically, but found no new leads. In July 2023, 32 years after Marlowe disappeared, the Douglas County Sheriff's Department received a phone call from a man who said his name was Marlowe Kenrick, that he had been kidnapped in 1991, and he wanted to come home. The call was transferred to Detective James Morton, who now handled cold missing persons cases, and he listened as the man explained he had grown up in rural Oregon, that the woman he knew as his mother had died recently, and while going through her belongings he had found newspaper clippings about a missing boy from Lake Tahoe who looked exactly like him. The man said his name had been changed to Marcus Wright. He was now 38 years old. He worked as a landscaper in Bend, Oregon, and he had always known something was wrong because he had fragmented memories from before age 6 that did not match what his mother had told him. He remembered a lake, mountains, a red backpack, a younger brother, and a woman with dark hair who was not the woman who raised him, and when he saw the newspaper clippings showing Marlowe Kenrick and his family, something clicked, and he knew that was his real identity. Morton was skeptical because over the years many people had claimed to be Marlowe hoping for attention or reward money. But something about this man's story felt different. The details were specific, the memories were consistent, and Morton agreed to meet with him. The man who called himself Marcus Wright drove to Carson City and met with Morton at the sheriff's department, and Morton saw immediately that he looked remarkably like the age progression photos of Marlowe, Pale blonde hair, now darker but still light, pale blue eyes, similar facial structure. Morton collected a DNA sample from the man and also contacted Janet and Stephen Kenrick, who still lived in Carson City, now in their 60s, and he told them someone claiming to be Marlowe had come forward, and they needed to provide DNA samples for comparison. Janet started crying on the phone, asking if it could really be him, if after 32 years her son might be alive, and Morton said he did not know yet. They needed to wait for DNA results, but he understood her hope and her fear. The DNA samples were sent to the Nevada State Crime Lab with a request for expedited processing, and Morton also requested that they search for any evidence from the original 1991 investigation that might contain DNA, particularly Marlowe's red backpack if it had ever been found. 2 weeks later, the DNA results came back, and Morton sat in his office reading the report with his hands shaking. The DNA from Marcus Wright matched Janet and Stephen Kenrick with a probability of parentage exceeding 99.9%. Marcus Wright was definitively Marlowe Kenrick. Morton called Janet and Stephen and asked them to come to his office, and when they arrived, he told them the news. Their son was alive. The man who had come forward was truly Marlowe, and Janet collapsed into Stephen's arms, sobbing, while Stephen stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. They asked when they could see him, and Morton said Marlowe wanted to meet them but was nervous and overwhelmed, and they arranged a meeting for the following day at the sheriff's department where counselors would be present to help facilitate the reunion. The meeting was emotional and awkward. Janet and Stephen seeing their 6-year-old son in the face of a 38-year-old stranger, and Marlowe looking at parents he barely remembered, and they hugged and cried and asked questions, trying to bridge 32 years of separation. Marlowe explained that the woman who raised him, Sandra Wright, had told him his parents had died in a car accident when he was young, that she was his aunt and had adopted him, and he had believed this story his entire childhood because he had no reason to doubt it. But as he grew older, he had noticed inconsistencies. Sandra had no photographs of his supposed parents. She avoided questions about family history, and she moved them frequently, living in remote areas of Oregon, homeschooling him, keeping him isolated from other children and authorities. When Sandra died in June 2023 from cancer, Marlowe had gone through her belongings and found a box hidden in her closet containing newspaper clippings about his disappearance, a fake birth certificate with the name Marcus Wright, and his red backpack with the astronaut patch. Inside the backpack were his rock collection, his bird identification book, and items from his childhood that Sandra had kept hidden for 3 decades. And seeing these objects triggered memories that came flooding back, and he knew he had been kidnapped, that his life had been a lie. Morton asked Marlowe if he remembered anything about the day he disappeared, and Marlowe said his memories were fragmented, but he remembered a woman approaching him on the trail. She had asked if he wanted to see baby birds in a nest, and he had followed her off the trail into the forest. He remembered the woman saying his parents had asked her to take him on an adventure, and he had believed her because he was 6 and trusted adults, and she had led him to a car parked on a forest road, and she had driven him away while he cried, asking for his mother. The woman was Sandra Wright, and Marlowe now understood she had been at Lake Tahoe that day specifically to take him, had been watching his family, had waited for an opportunity, and she had successfully abducted him in broad daylight while hundreds of people were nearby. Morton asked why Sandra would have done this, what her connection to the Kenrick family was, and Marlowe said he had no idea. Sandra had never explained, and she had taken the truth to her grave, but there had to be some reason she had targeted him specifically. Morton began investigating Sandra Wright's background, and he discovered she had been born in Reno in 1952, making her 39 when she kidnapped Marlowe, and she had worked as a nurse at various hospitals throughout Nevada during the 1980s. Digging deeper, Morton found that Sandra had worked at Carson Tahoe Hospital in Carson City from 1984 to 1987, and this was significant because Janet Kenrick had given birth to Marlowe at that hospital in June 1985. Morton pulled hospital records and found that Sandra Wright had been working in the maternity ward when Marlowe was born, and she would have had access to patient information including the Kenrick family's address and personal details. He also discovered that Sandra had been fired from Carson Tahoe Hospital in October 1987, following complaints about her becoming inappropriately attached to patients and their babies, and several mothers had reported Sandra making them uncomfortable with excessive interest in their infants. 20 years later, One overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. Morton realized Sandra had likely become obsessed with Marlowe as a baby, had been forced to leave her job before she could act on her obsession, and had spent years planning to take him, waiting until the family went on vacation, where she could blend in with tourists and take him without immediate detection. He searched through evidence from the original investigation, and the red backpack that had been found in Sandra's belongings was submitted to the crime lab for DNA analysis, and they found Marlowe's DNA as expected, but they also found female DNA that matched a profile in the system. Sandra Wright had been fingerprinted when she worked at hospitals, and her DNA had been entered into databases during a background check in 2010 when she had applied for a nursing position in Oregon, and that DNA matched the profile on Marlowe's backpack. Detective Morton presented his findings to the Kenrick family, explaining that Sandra Wright had worked in the maternity ward when Marlowe was born, had likely become obsessed with him as an infant, and had waited years for the opportunity to take him, finally succeeding at Lake Tahoe in 1991. Janet was horrified, realizing the woman who had kidnapped her son had held him as a newborn, had been present during some of the most vulnerable moments of her early motherhood, and had used that access to plan an abduction that had destroyed their family for 3 decades. Stephen asked why no one had suspected Sandra during the original investigation, and Morton explained that in 1991, there were thousands of tourists at Lake Tahoe. Sandra had blended in perfectly, and investigators had no way to connect a former hospital employee to a random hiking trail abduction. Marlowe struggled with conflicting emotions. He had loved Sandra as his mother for 38 years. She had raised him and cared for him, but she had also stolen him from his real family, had lied to him his entire life, and had destroyed the childhood he should have had. He had memories of a relatively normal childhood with Sandra, homeschooling in rural Oregon, helping her with gardening, reading books together, and she had never been cruel or abusive, had simply kept him isolated and hidden, and processing this complexity was overwhelming. Janet and Stephen wanted Marlowe to move back to Carson City, to reconnect with them and with Dylan, who was now 36 and stunned to learn his brother was alive. But Marlowe needed time, needed to process his identity, needed to reconcile who he thought he was with who he actually was. Dylan met Marlowe for the first time in 32 years, and the reunion was strange and emotional. Dylan had only vague memories of his older brother, and Marlowe had no clear memories of Dylan at all, and they tried to find common ground as strangers who were also brothers. The media coverage of Marlowe's reappearance was massive. The story of a boy kidnapped at 6 and returned at 38 captivated the nation, and journalists wanted interviews, documentary producers wanted to tell the story, and the Kenrick family was overwhelmed by attention. Janet and Stephen declined most interview requests, but they did agree to one press conference, where Janet thanked everyone who had searched for Marlowe, who had kept his case alive, and who had never given up hope that he might be found, and she urged other families to never stop believing. Marlowe returned to Bend, Oregon to settle Sandra's estate and to process everything that had happened, and he found himself going through her belongings with new eyes, looking for clues about why she had taken him, looking for evidence of the woman behind the mother he had known. He found a journal Sandra had kept, and in it she had written about seeing Marlowe as a newborn at Carson Tahoe Hospital, about feeling an instant connection, about believing he was meant to be her son, and about the devastation of being fired before she could pursue that feeling. She had written about watching the Kenrick family from a distance, about learning their routines, about discovering they went to Lake Tahoe every summer, and about planning for years how she would take Marlowe and give him the life she believed he deserved with her. Sandra had convinced herself she was rescuing Marlowe from something, though her journal never specified what, and she had rationalized the kidnapping as an act of love, as giving him a better life, and she had never expressed remorse or acknowledgement that she had committed a crime. Morton closed the case officially in September 2023, and because Sandra Wright was dead, there would be no trial, no prosecution, no public accounting of what she had done, just the DNA evidence and the journal proving she had kidnapped Marlowe and raised him as her own. The case raised questions about how hospitals screened employees, about how someone with obsessive tendencies had been allowed to work in maternity wards, and about how Sandra had successfully hidden for 32 years in rural Oregon without ever being identified or caught. Marlowe began therapy to process his trauma and his identity crisis, and he struggled with what to call himself. Marcus was the name he had used for 38 years. Marlowe was the name his parents had given him, and he felt caught between two identities that both felt incomplete. He decided to legally change his name to Marlowe Marcus Kenrick Wright, honoring both identities, acknowledging that he was both the boy who had been taken and the man who had been raised by Sandra, and that integrating both was the only way forward. Janet and Stephen visited Marlowe in Oregon regularly, and slowly they built a relationship, not the parent-child relationship they had lost, but something new, an adult friendship between people who shared biology and tragedy and were trying to find connection despite the years of separation. Dylan struggled with his own feelings. He had been the youngest child, had grown up as an only child after Marlowe disappeared, and now suddenly he had an older brother again, and navigating that relationship was complicated and required patience and therapy. The Kenrick family held a celebration in December 2023, marking Marlowe's return and acknowledging the miracle of his survival, and extended family who had been at Lake Tahoe in 1991 gathered to meet the man Marlowe had become and to process their own emotions about his reappearance. The months following Marlowe's return were difficult for everyone as they adjusted to a reality that felt surreal. 32 years of grief and loss could not be erased by his reappearance, and the family had to learn how to be together while acknowledging everything they had missed. Janet struggled with guilt that she had not protected Marlowe, that she had let him walk on that trail, that she had not noticed him leaving, and therapy helped her understand she bore no responsibility for Sandra's calculated crime. Stephen had retired from accounting but found himself unable to enjoy retirement, his mind constantly returning to the years Marlowe had been missing, to the searches and the hopes and the gradual acceptance that his son was gone, and now having him back felt like a gift he did not deserve. Marlowe moved to Carson City in early 2024, renting an apartment near his parents, and he began the slow process of building a life in the city where he was born, finding work as a landscaper, making friends, and learning about the family he had been stolen from. He met cousins and aunts and uncles who had been at Lake Tahoe that day, who had searched for him, who had marked his birthday every year, and they welcomed him with tears and hugs, and he tried to remember faces from his fragmented childhood memories. His grandparents, Paul and Margaret, were now in their 80s, and seeing Marlowe alive was overwhelming. They had never expected this outcome, had mourned their grandson for decades, and having him return felt miraculous and impossible and deeply emotional. Dylan and Marlowe developed a friendship that felt tentative and careful. They met for coffee weekly, talked about their lives, tried to find common ground, and slowly they built something that resembled brotherhood, even if it did not match what they might have had if they had grown up together. The red backpack with the astronaut patch was returned to Marlowe after DNA processing was complete, and he kept it in his apartment, and sometimes he would look at the rock collection and the bird identification book and remember the 6-year-old boy he had been. He thought about the life he would have had if Sandra had not taken him. He would have grown up with Dylan, would have gone to school in Carson City, would have had friends and normalcy, and while he could not change the past, he could honor that lost childhood by living fully now. The Kenrick family established a foundation in 2025 called the Marlowe Project, dedicated to supporting families of long-term missing children and funding DNA technology and database improvements that could lead to identifications and reunifications. The foundation also advocated for better hospital employee screening, for monitoring of individuals who showed obsessive behavior toward patients or children, and for creating systems to prevent people like Sandra Wright from having access to vulnerable families. Janet became a spokesperson for families of missing children, and she spoke at conferences about never giving up hope, about the importance of keeping cases active, about trusting that answers might come even after decades, and her story inspired other families to continue searching. Marlowe participated in a documentary about his case in 2026, and he spoke candidly about his complicated feelings, about loving Sandra while understanding she had committed a terrible crime, about grieving for the childhood he lost while being grateful for the life he had. He emphasized that he did not want Sandra villainized completely. She had been mentally ill and obsessed, but she had also raised him with kindness, and he could hold both truths simultaneously, that she had harmed him deeply, and that she had loved him in her broken way. The documentary sparked conversations about how society handles mental illness, about how obsession can escalate to crime, about how hospitals and institutions need better systems for identifying concerning behavior, and about the lifelong impact of parental abduction, even when the child is eventually recovered. Detective James Morton retired in 2028 after 35 years in law enforcement, and Marlowe's case remained his most extraordinary achievement, not solving a murder but reuniting a family, proving that missing children could come home even after decades, and giving hope to countless other families. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives, where new stories are shared every day. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence, because families deserve answers, and evidence deserves to be heard. And sometimes the most shocking truth is not death, but survival. Not an ending, but an unexpected reunion. Marlowe Kenrick was 6 years old when he vanished from a family hike at Lake Tahoe. He had pale blonde hair and quiet blue eyes. He loved collecting rocks and bird feathers, and though he was stolen by someone who had held him as a newborn, he survived and returned home 32 years later. Not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to resilience and the power of DNA technology, as proof that missing children can be found alive even after decades, as inspiration for families to never stop hoping, and as a reminder that obsession can hide behind caring professions. His red backpack with the astronaut patch captured the DNA that confirmed his identity and exposed Sandra Wright's crime. And that backpack waited 32 years until Marlowe found it and understood the truth. And in the end, his story became not about loss, but about return. Not about death, but about a second chance. Proving that some families do get their miracles, that some missing children do come home, that DNA can reunite as well as solve, and that even after 3 decades of separation, even after a childhood stolen and a life lived under false pretenses, coming home is always possible and love can bridge even the longest absence.